A Creole cottage on Bayou La Fourche has been standing on the same 4 brick piers since 1844. The piers are 11 inches square. They are pocked and stained and worn at the corners, and on the side of the third pier, 3 faint horizontal lines record the 3 worst floods in the cottage's 182-year history. 1915, 1965, 2005. The piers were designed to flood. The brick was fired porous enough to let water seep in and out. The wood-framed house above the piers, cypress walls, cypress floors, French doors opening onto a gallery that wraps 3 sides, was lifted high enough to stay dry while the floodwater passed through the ground floor like a tide. A bayou house was built around the assumption that the water would come. What it could not survive was the slow disappearance of the ground itself. Walk around the 4 piers of the cottage on a low July morning before the air gets hot. The grass is cut close to the brick. The brick is dark at the bottom from 180 years of seasonal wetness, lighter at the top where the eaves of the gallery have shaded it. Each pier sits on a flat cypress sill, 3 inches thick, set on a small foundation of older brick rubble. The sill is more than a century old. It has not rotted. Cypress in the bayou country does not rot the way pine does. It silvers, it weathers, it darkens, it lasts. The third pier is the one with the marks. The marks are not painted. They are not carved. They are the slow chemical record of water sitting against the brick for hours or days, silt and tannin and oxidized iron pressed into the clay surface, and then the water receded and the line stayed. The lowest line is 18 inches off the ground. It dates to the unnamed storm of September 1915, the storm that the local newspaper called the worst storm in living memory, and that older residents of La Fourche Parish for the rest of their lives called simply the high water of 15. The second line is 2 feet above it. That line is Hurricane Betsy, September of 1965. The third line is at chest height now, 3 feet higher again, weathered out to almost nothing. That line is Katrina, August 29, 2005. Each of those floods, in its own moment, was the highest water that anyone in that part of Louisiana had ever seen. Each of those floods passed through the ground floor of this cottage and left the upper floor dry. That is what the cottage was built to do. The cottage was built in 1844 by a family whose name does not survive in the deed record. By 1860, it had passed to a sugar planter. By 1920, it had passed to a small dairy farmer. By 2026, it belongs to a preservation trust, lived in part of the year by a married couple whose children visit on weekends, and the rest of the year by no one. It is one of perhaps 3,000 surviving cottages of its type, scattered across the lower parishes of South Louisiana. There were probably 40 or 50,000 of them once. Walk up the wooden stairs onto the gallery. The stairs are at one corner, half hidden behind a louvered screen. The gallery runs the full width of the front of the house and then turns the corner and runs along both sides. The depth is 8 feet. The ceiling is 12 feet up, painted pale blue, what the Creoles called haint blue. The color was believed in the folk traditions of the Caribbean and the Low Country to keep evil spirits and wasps from nesting. Most cottages of this period have at least one ceiling painted that color. Look at the wall behind you. The wall is plastered, painted white. Knock on it. The sound is dense, almost dull, like knocking on packed earth. Behind the plaster is something that was not wood and not brick. In the 1840s, when this cottage was built, the wall behind the plaster was built by hand. The carpenter, almost certainly an enslaved African-American craftsman in this part of Louisiana in 1844, set up a frame of heavy cypress posts, 8 inches square, 8 feet apart, running from the sill up to the rafters. Between the posts, he and his crew packed a mixture of wet clay and Spanish moss, dug from the bayou bank, and pulled from the live oaks in the yard. The mixture was worked by hand and by foot into the spaces between the cypress, like the chinking on a log cabin, but thicker, denser, almost a half-foot wide between the inner and outer face of the wall. When the wall was dry, it was sealed under a coat of lime plaster, and the plaster was painted. The technique had a name. The Acadians who had arrived in Louisiana 80 years earlier, expelled from Nova Scotia by the British in 1755, and resettled along these bayous in the 1760s, called it Busi Achi. The Creoles who had arrived earlier from the Caribbean called it the same thing. It meant roughly the mudwork. A bayou house wall behind its plaster was made of mud and Spanish moss. This was not a poverty technique. This was not a temporary technique. This was the wall material of Louisiana for almost 200 years. Walk out onto the gallery and look down. The cottage floor is 40 inches above the bare ground. The gallery floor is the same height. Beneath the floor, between the four piers, is a packed earth crawl space, dim, 12 feet wide, with the cypress floor joists running across it like rafters seen from below. The reason the cottage is raised is in the soil. The soil, 6 feet below where you are standing, is wet. Pull a coring drill out of the ground beside the cottage and the soil that comes back up is dark, sticky, organic, half-rotted. It is what soil scientists call hydric soil. It is the soil of a wetland. A house built directly on this soil, without elevation, will sink. The wood will rot from the bottom. The plaster will wick moisture. The room will smell all year of mildew. The Acadians who settled along these bayous in the 1760s initially built houses directly on the ground. Steep cypress shingle roofs, 2 rooms, dirt floors, a hearth on one wall. Within 20 years, the first generation of Acadian builders learned, by watching their houses fail, that this approach did not work. The second generation raised the houses on piers. The piers were sometimes cypress. More often, after about 1820, they were brick. The brick was fired locally in small kilns along the bayou bank, using the Louisiana clay that lay just beneath the loam. The clay was abundant, cheap, and made a porous brick that flexed slightly in the heat and could absorb water without crumbling. A bayou house brick is not the same as a Virginia or Charleston brick. It is softer, more porous, less precise. It can be made by a small crew of 2 or 3 workers in a season. Once the house was elevated, 2 things happened. The wood stopped rotting. The cypress floors and beams with air circulating beneath them lasted 150 years instead of 20. And when the bayou rose, which it did, 3 or 4 times in any given decade, the water passed through the brick piers without taking the house with it. The ground floor was sacrificial. The piers were sacrificial. The brick could be replaced. The cypress floor above could not be. A bayou house, in this sense, was not built to avoid flooding. It was built to survive flooding. The 2 strategies look similar from a distance and are entirely different in construction. Walk to the edge of the gallery and look out. The bayou is 40 yards away, across a sloping grass yard, with a wooden landing at the end of a short path. The landing is 6 feet wide. A pirogue, the flat-bottomed cypress canoe that has been the basic personal transport of South Louisiana for 200 years, is tied to a post. The water in the bayou is dark green-brown, glass still in the morning, slow-moving. Now look at the cottage behind you. The cottage faces the bayou. The front door, the door with the brass kick plate and the cleaner paint and the small lantern hook beside it, opens toward the water. There is no road in front of the cottage. The road, when you find it, is on the other side. The road is behind the cottage. The road is, by the architectural logic of the bayou house, the backyard. For 200 years, this was the orientation of Louisiana family life. The house faced the water. The bayou was the road. The bayou was the highway. The bayou was the front yard. If you look at an aerial photograph of any inhabited stretch of Bayou La Fourche or Bayou Teche or Bayou Terrebonne, Taken before about 1930, the property lines look strange. They are not square, they are not blocks, they are long, narrow ribbons, sometimes 400 feet wide and 3 miles deep, running away from the bayou like the teeth of a comb. Every property touches the water at one end. Every property runs back into the swamp at the other. The system has a name. French colonial surveyors called it the arpent system. An arpent was a French unit of length, roughly 192 feet. A standard bayou frontage farm was 4 arpents wide and 40 arpents deep, a thin, narrow strip running from the water back into the woods. The American legal system, after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, preserved this older French geometry. Property along the bayous still works this way. 2026 tax assessor maps in La Fourche and Terrebonne parishes still show the long lot pattern, 220 years after the Americans took over. The house was always at the front. The kitchen garden was behind the house. The smokehouse, the chicken yard, the cane field, the cotton field, the worker cabins, they ran in a line, away from the bayou, into the swamp. The closer to the water you were, the more important you were to the household. The further back, the less visible. This is why the architecture of the bayou house always faces the water and never faces the road. The road was an afterthought. The wall behind the plaster on the cottage's south gallery has, in one place, peeled. A small flap of plaster, about the size of a dinner plate, has come loose at chest height where the wall meets a window frame. The Preservation Trust that owns the cottage has left it that way. Behind the peeled plaster is the bousillage, the mud and moss fill, visible in a pale gray, almost cement-colored packed mass. You can see, embedded in it, the strands of Spanish moss, still recognizable after 180 years. Reach into the gap and touch the surface. The bousillage is cold. It is denser than concrete. It is harder than you expect. It has not been touched by a human hand since 1844. The wall behind the plaster was not built by the family that lived in the cottage. The wall was built by enslaved labor. This is the central, often elided fact of the antebellum bayou house. The Acadian and Creole families who owned the houses commissioned them, lived in them, and posed for the photographs that later became the postcards of Louisiana tourism. The houses themselves were built, felled, milled, framed, plastered, and finished by enslaved African-American craftsmen. In the antebellum sugar parishes along Bayou Teche and Bayou La Fourche, where the most elaborate of the Creole and Greek Revival bayou mansions were built between 1815 and 1860, the labor of construction was almost entirely enslaved. The carpenter who hewed the cypress posts at Maison Olivier, built around 1815 along Bayou Teche, was enslaved. The mason who fired the brick for the piers and the ground floor walls at Chateaux on the Teche, built in 1834 near New Iberia, was enslaved. The skilled woodworker who turned the columns and cut the staircase rail at Bayside, built around 1850 in Iberia Parish, was enslaved. In the smaller Acadian and Cajun farmhouses along Bayou La Fourche and Bayou Vermilion, the houses where modest families lived without owning anyone else, construction was often done by the family itself, with neighbors and kin, in the rural barn, raising tradition the Acadians had brought from Nova Scotia. But even here, much of the skilled work, the brickwork on the piers, the joinery of the door and window frames, was contracted out to local craftsmen, some white, many free people of color who had learned the trade as enslaved workers in their youth and now operated as paid artisans in the post-emancipation economy. Free people of color in 19th century Louisiana, particularly in the parishes around New Orleans and along Bayou St. John, were a substantial population. They were not enslaved, they were not white, they were a distinct legal and social class, often educated, often skilled, often owning property and businesses. Many of the most accomplished carpenters, plasterers, iron workers, and masons in Louisiana between 1810 and 1860 were free people of color. The ironwork on the galleries of many Creole cottages along Bayou St. John, for example, the curling balcony rails and the decorative grills that French Quarter tourists today photograph as French, was made by free black iron workers, often working in shops only blocks from the cottage. The wall behind the plaster on this Lafourche cottage was made by hands the records do not name. The brick on the piers was fired by hands the records do not name. The cypress floor under your feet was milled and laid by hands the records do not name. The cottage has had 3 owners. The cottage has had hundreds of builders. 40 miles west of where you are standing, the Atchafalaya River drains the Mississippi's overflow into a vast wetland called the Atchafalaya Basin, 1,500 square miles of cypress swamp, bayou, and shallow lake, the largest river swamp ecosystem in North America. Before the Army Corps of Engineers built the modern levee system in the 1930s, the basin flooded annually, sometimes catastrophically, with no fixed banks and no permanent ground. Most of the basin was for half the year underwater. People lived in it anyway. For roughly 50 years, between approximately 1875 and the 1930s, an estimated several hundred families lived in houses that floated, not summer cottages, not seasonal camps, their primary residence, the house where the family ate 3 meals a day, where children were born, where grandparents died, where 4 generations sometimes lived at the same time, was a rectangular wooden structure 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, set on a barge made of cottonwood logs tied to a willow on the bank of a bayou. The structure held 3 rooms inside. A walkway 6 feet wide ran around all 4 sides of the exterior. The walkway was the front porch, the back porch, the kitchen extension, and the play yard for the children. The cottonwood logs were chosen because cottonwood, of all the available Louisiana woods, floated longest before becoming waterlogged. A well-made cottonwood barge could hold a houseboat for 15 or 20 years before the logs needed replacement. When the bayou flooded, the house rose with the water. When the fish moved, the house could be untied and floated to follow them. When a hurricane was forecast, the house could be poled into a sheltered bend in a smaller bayou and tied to 4 trees at once. The houseboat communities of the Atchafalaya Basin had names: Bayou Cheney, Bayou Long, Atchafalaya Crossroads. They were clusters of 15, 20, sometimes 40 houseboats moored together at protected bends. The families who lived in them were predominantly Cajun, descendants of the Acadians who had been settled in Louisiana a century earlier. Most could not read. Most spoke Cajun French, a dialect of 18th century rural French preserved in oral form in the basin. Most knew the basin, its currents, its fish, its alligators, its safe channels, its drowned trees, better than anyone outside the basin could imagine. The Folklife archives at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge contain the oral histories of dozens of these houseboat residents, recorded in the 1970s and 1980s, when the youngest of them were already in their 70s. The recordings are, in many cases, the only documentation that exists of how the houseboat system actually worked. By 1950, the houseboat communities were almost entirely gone. The levee system the Army Corps had built in the 1930s to manage Mississippi River floods had reshaped the basin's hydrology, made the seasonal flood cycle more controlled, and rendered the traditional houseboat way of life both legally regulated and practically harder to sustain. Most of the houseboats had been winched onto banks and set on blocks, frozen in place like stranded ships, eventually converted into permanent ground-based dwellings or torn down for lumber. The same architectural logic, the family living at the water's edge, the house designed to survive flooding, the labor of women on the deck while men were on the water, that produced the brick pier cottage on Bayou Lafourche also produced the cottonwood log houseboat in the Atchafalaya. The form differed. The system was the same: the wraparound porch of the La Fourche cottage, the wraparound deck of the Atchafalaya houseboat, the same square footage of outdoor working space, the same domestic life happening at the perimeter of the building. The houseboats are gone? The cottage is still here? For now. September 29, 1915, 6 in the morning, the Gulf of Mexico just south of the mouth of the Mississippi. An unnamed hurricane, the National Weather Service did not begin naming storms until 1953, comes ashore at Grand Isle. The barometric pressure measured at the Burwood weather station before the instrument flooded and went silent was 931 millibars. By modern measurement, that is a Category 4 storm. Winds at landfall were estimated, in retrospect, at 145 miles per hour. The storm pushed a wall of water from the Gulf into the bayous. The water moved up Bayou La Fourche, up Bayou Terrebonne, up the small distributary bayous in between, and into the parishes inland. By mid-morning, the water at the La Fourche cottage was at 18 inches against the third pier, the lowest line. The cottage stayed. The piers absorbed the water. The brick darkened. The cypress floor joists, lifted 3 feet above the floodwater, did not get wet. The French doors on the gallery, the cypress floorboards, the bousillage walls behind the plaster, all of it stayed dry. The family who lived in the cottage in 1915, an Acadian-descended dairy farmer, his wife, and their 4 children, sat out the storm on the front gallery, watching the water rise across the yard and recede over the next 30 hours. The storm killed an estimated 275 people across South Louisiana. Most of them were in low-lying coastal settlements where the houses had not been built on piers. The cottages that were on piers, the great majority of them by 1915, were intact when the water went back. The La Fourche cottage, after 1915, was inspected by the parish road inspector. The report survives in the parish archives. The inspector wrote, "House intact, lower walls of pier wet but sound, roof intact, garden destroyed." He moved on to the next house. There were thousands of houses to inspect. This was the moment at which the Bayou House was working at its peak. The system, the brick piers, the cypress walls, the wraparound gallery, the bousillage infill, had been refined over 150 years to survive exactly this. The storm came. The house took the storm. The house was still there. The storm of 1915 was the strongest test the Bayou House had been given to that point. The Bayou House passed. But the dairy farmer, standing on the gallery that afternoon as the water receded, could see something the inspector did not write down. He could see, across the bayou, 3 lots downstream, that 2 houses that had been standing in 1914 were no longer there. They had not been knocked down. They were not piles of rubble. The lots themselves were gone. Where the lots had been, in 1914, there was now open water. The bayou had widened. This is the first time in the history of the cottage that the form of the land itself had changed. It would not be the last. By 1925, a paved road runs through the back of the cottage's property. The road did not exist before. 1921. The parish had begun paving the inland route that connected Houma and Thibodaux and Raceland in 1918, finished it in 1921, and by 1925 it carried regular automobile traffic. The road runs across what had been the back of the cottage's farm, what would have been, in 1880, the kitchen garden, the chicken yard, the smokehouse. By 1925, the kitchen garden has been moved. The chicken yard has been moved. The smokehouse, no longer needed in an era when families are buying meat at the grocery store in Thibodaux, has been torn down. And something stranger has happened to the cottage itself. The cottage no longer faces the bayou. That is not quite right. The cottage itself still faces the bayou. The front door is still on the bayou side. But the family who lives in the cottage no longer treats the bayou side as the front of the house. The front of the house in the 1920s is the roadside. The road is where the deliveries come from. The road is where the Model T is parked. The road is where the children walk to the new parish school, which opens in 1923. For 2 centuries, the bayou had been the front yard. In the span of about 10 years, between 1920 and 1930, the road became the front yard. The cottage's architecture stayed the same, but the meaning of its orientation flipped. The oil and gas industry arrived next. By 1930, the first commercial oil discovery in Lafourche Parish had been made at Leeville. By 1940, Terrebonne and Lafourche were producing significant volumes of oil and gas. The men of the cottage's family, the dairy farmers' sons by then in their 40s and 50s, were not dairy farmers anymore. One was a roughneck on a Gulf Coast rig. 2 were carpenters in the boom town of Morgan City. One had moved to Houston. The dairy operation behind the cottage was wound down by 1950. The cottage was electrified in 1948. By 1955, it had a window unit air conditioner in the rear bedroom. By 1960, the gallery, the wraparound porch that had been the family's daytime room for 110 years, was used a few hours a week, mostly in early spring and late fall. The architecture of the bayou house had been adapted very slightly to the new ways of living. The bousillage walls were still there. The cypress floors were still there. The brick piers, with the line of 1915 still faintly visible on the third one, were still there. But the system around the architecture, the system that had made the architecture necessary, was dissolving. By 1960, the cottage was no longer a working bayou house. It was an old bayou house that a family lived in. The difference was about to matter. September 9th, 1965. Hurricane Betsy, a Category 3 storm with winds of 125 miles per hour and a barometric pressure of 948 millibars, makes landfall near Grand Isle, 50 miles southwest of New Orleans. The eye of the storm passes directly over Lafourche Parish. Betsy's storm surge is higher than 1915's. The water at the Lafourche cottage reaches the second line on the third pier. 2 feet of water sits in the crawl space beneath the cottage floor for 16 hours before it begins to recede. The cottage stays. The brick piers do what they were designed to do. The water passes through. The cypress floor joists, dampened on their lower edges but not submerged, do not rot. The French doors stay closed. The bousillage walls behind their plaster stay intact. The family, the dairy farmer's grandson, his wife, and their 3 teenage children, ride out the storm in the attic, the same way the dairy farmer had ridden out the storm of 1915 on the gallery 50 years earlier. The next morning, the grandson walks out onto the gallery. The yard is under 12 inches of water. The bayou is high and brown. The road behind the house is impassable, but the gallery is dry. The kitchen is dry. The bedrooms upstairs are dry. The cottage is intact. But the grandson, like his grandfather 50 years before, can see something the cottage inspectors will not write in their reports. He can see, looking across the bayou and down to the south, that the bayou is wider than it was the morning before. Not by much, by 20 feet, maybe 30. He can see, at the edge of his vision, an oil and gas service canal cut by an industry crew in 1952, running into the wetland a quarter-mile away. The canal is wider this morning than it was last week. He can see at the south end of his own property, the long lot that runs 3,000 feet from the bayou back through what used to be the dairy field, that an area that had been pasture in 1960 is now standing water. Betsy did not destroy his cottage. Betsy did not destroy his property. But Betsy demonstrated to anyone willing to look that the land underneath the property was no longer what it used to be. Between 1930, when the Army Corps of Engineers completed the major levee work along the Mississippi River, and 1965, the state of Louisiana had lost an estimated 500 square miles of coastal wetland. That is roughly the area of the city of Houston. The land had not been built on. It had not been flooded. It had not been hit by hurricanes. It had simply gone, sunk, eroded, dissolved into open water because the Mississippi River, walled off from the wetland by levees, was no longer delivering the sediment that had been building South Louisiana for the previous 5,000 years. The cottage was designed to survive flooding. The cottage was not designed to survive the disappearance of the wetland on which it stood. The grandson could not have known, watching the bayou widen the morning after Betsy in 1965, that the disappearance had just begun. Look at a satellite map of South Louisiana taken in 1955 and at the same map taken in 2025. Place them side by side. The change is visible without zooming in. In 1955, the coast of Louisiana, the line where solid land ends and the Gulf of Mexico begins, is a thick, irregular fringe of marsh and barrier island, running from the Texas border to the Mississippi border. The fringe is, in some places, 50 miles wide. The bayous of La Fourche, Terrebonne, and Plaquemines run through it like veins through a green leaf. In 2025, the fringe is gone in many places. The bayous still exist, but the marsh between them has been replaced in much of the lower parishes by open water. What was a green leaf in 1955 is, in 2025, an open hand of skeletal channels with no flesh between them. Between 1930 and 2025, the state of Louisiana lost more than 2,000 square miles of coastal wetland. That is an area roughly the size of Delaware. It is roughly the size of Rhode Island. It is the largest documented land loss in the recorded history of any American state. It happened underneath a community of approximately 150,000 people who lived along the bayous of South Louisiana. Many of them lived in houses their grandparents and great-grandparents had built. Many of those houses were 200 years old. The houses, in most cases, did not collapse. The houses did not burn. The houses did not flood beyond what they had been designed to flood. They were not destroyed. The land beneath them dissolved. The Isle de Jean-Charles community in Terrebonne Parish, descended from Houma and Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw families who had lived on the island since the 1830s, lost more than 98% of its land between 1955 and 2020. In 1955, the island was 22,000 acres. By 2020, it was about 320 acres. The houses that had stood on the lost land were not destroyed by hurricanes. The hurricanes had passed through every decade, and the houses had survived. What killed them was the slow conversion of marsh into open water, the salt water from the Gulf creeping inland through the dying wetlands, killing the trees that had held the ground together, killing the grass roots that had held the soil together, until the soil itself washed away. The federal government formally relocated the surviving residents of Ile de Jean-Charles to higher ground in Terrebonne Parish in 2022. It was the first federally funded climate-driven community relocation in the recorded history of the United States. The houses the residents left behind, the houses that had survived a century and a half of storms, are now reefs. This is what happens when the architecture is more durable than the ground. The Bayou house was built to a climate logic. The climate logic still works. The bousillage walls still work. The brick piers still work. The cypress floors still work. The gallery still works. What no longer works is the assumption that the wetland will be there. The wetland is no longer there. August 29, 2005. Hurricane Katrina makes landfall in Plaquemines Parish, southeast of the La Fourche cottage. The wind at the cottage is sustained at 90 miles an hour. The bayou rises and the water reaches the third line on the third pier, 3 feet up. The cottage stays. By the morning of August 30th, the cottage is empty. Its piers are wet to the third line. Its gallery is dry. Its bousillage walls are intact. But the storm has done something to the parish that even Betsy did not do. The combination of storm surge, the open water that has replaced what was marsh, and the loss of the cypress and oak trees that had once broken the wind has made Katrina more destructive, mile for mile, than any prior storm in the La Fourche record. The roads behind the cottage are impassable for 2 weeks. 3 of the cottage's neighbor houses, all of them on similar brick piers, are destroyed not by water but by airborne debris, by trees ripped out of soft soil, by storm-driven barges from the intracoastal waterway colliding with the bayou banks. The cottage stays. But the cottage is one of fewer than it used to be. Walk now, in 2026, down the La Fourche Road behind the cottage. The road runs south for 40 miles along Bayou La Fourche, from Raceland down to Golden Meadow. In 1930, this road would have carried you past several hundred bayou house cottages on similar brick piers. By 1980, perhaps 300 remained. By 2005, perhaps 120. By 2026, the number, according to the La Fourche Parish Heritage Survey, is fewer than 70. The houses that are left are not mostly occupied by working families. They are mostly vacation rentals, second homes, weekend cottages, and museum properties. The Bayou La Fourche Folklife and Heritage Museum at Lockport. The restored cottages at Laurel Valley Village in nearby Thibodaux. The few remaining family-occupied bayou houses are owned mostly by people in their 70s and 80s, by families that lost a generation of children to Houston and New Orleans and Lafayette, by households whose insurance premiums have tripled since 2005. Walk back now to the cottage, stand at the front gallery again, look out across the bayou, 3 floodlines on the 3rd pier, the lowest one, 1915, the middle one, 1965, the highest one, 2005. 3 storms, 3 high waters, 3 centuries of weather, surviving by the same brick pier and the same cypress sill and the same bousillage wall. The cottage is doing what it was built to do, but the lots on either side of the cottage are empty. The bayou is wider than it was a century ago. The marsh behind the cottage, where the dairy field used to be, is now a strip of brackish reed perhaps 200 yards wide, with open water beyond. The road behind the cottage carries fewer cars than it did in 1980. The school the cottage's children walked to in 1923 closed in 1998. The architecture of the cottage is stronger than the land beneath it. The brick piers will outlast the wetland. The cypress floor will outlast the bayou. The bousillage walls, mud and Spanish moss packed by hand by an enslaved carpenter in 1844, sealed behind plaster, untouched for 182 years, will outlast everyone who knows what bousillage is. The chair on the gallery is empty. The bayou is still the bayou, but the family that built the cottage to live in the bayou and the families that came after them for 6 generations are mostly somewhere else, in higher ground, in places where the road is in the right place, where the schools are open, where the insurance is affordable, where the next storm and the next disappearance is not arriving at the wall of the building. What is left is the cottage. The cottage will be left a while longer. The land beneath it is going. This is what is left.